Welcome to Rants and Revelations with Mike and Steve, a place where theology and everyday life collide. The opinions expressed in Rants and Revelations with Mike and Steve are ours and ours alone. We're not seeking to make a documentary with incriminating evidence. We're just seeking to provide an avenue for us to express ourselves, tell our story, and help anybody who may be blessed by it. In doing so, we have changed some names and places for the sake of anonymity and to protect those who may not want their information given out. So I think my favorite part about the bumper is how I have a hard time saying anonymity. It's just my personal favorite.
You love that?
That's just me. Well, what's going on, Mike?
Hey, man, we're back recording again. That's what's going on.
The next episode, as Dr. Dre would say. Next episode. And today we're joined by special guest, pastor, and foodie extraordinaire, Lance Skifter.
Foodie extraordinaire because I eat a lot of it.
Yeah, all three of us fit
That's
that boat.
pretty much all of us.
Yeah, everything from Jack in the Box tacos up to filet mignon, right?
Hey,
No
if
discrimination.
you can combine the two, I'm a happy
I have
man.
a wide-ranging palate.
We're food woke. We don't discriminate. So that's how we roll. So anyway, Lance is here to join us because in the previous episode, we discussed some of the issues we ran into with Pastor Tom. That was the name we chose, right? Pastor Tom.
Yeah, Pastor Tom.
Trying to remember Pastor Tom. All those years I knew him as something else. Now it's Pastor Tom. So digging in, we wanted to bring Lance in and have an opportunity to get his perspective on everything, fill in some of the gaps, and help us along with where we lack, which is in plenty of ways.
Yeah.
I don't know, would you agree, Mike?
Absolutely. And for context, Lance is the third member of the trio we mentioned.
Yes.
We didn't want to mention his name because we hadn't had a chance to clear everything with him at that point, and now we obviously did because he's here.
Yeah.
So all three of us, I think, came to the Lord around the same time.
Yeah.
And we're at the original church where Pastor Tom came and created all the fun time antics that we discuss. So,
Yeah, it was good times. So Lance, a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, family, just what you want to share so the audio audience can know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, be part of this project as much as possible. I was born and raised here in Southern California. We started attending Church A.
that works.
I like that. Church A, yes.
We started attending Church A when I was about 8.5 years old. And so I'd been there a long time. But when I was 14, we moved to Minnesota. And so then I came back to Southern California. I was around 22, 23, something like that. And I came back to Southern California and eventually wound up back at Church A.
And you owned a restaurant for a while, didn't
I owned
you?
a restaurant in Minnesota. Yeah, I worked at restaurants for most of my life. And
Exciting stuff. So Lance, the relationship that we began at Church A, at least for me, because I came in late in the game, was short, but obviously long-lasting.
yeah,
Apparently, because you're here and we're talking to each other and giggling.
I'm here for Mike.
No, I'm here for Mike, too. It's actually an intervention, Mike. So.
Oh, boy. Is that why there's people in the hallway waiting?
we didn't want to tell you. We pretended it was a bar mitzvah for you finally, but
It's long
really an
overdue.
intervention. It's really an intervention.
I'm still not really mature enough for a bar mitzvah, though.
This is true. That goes for all of us. So as we dig in, we're going to focus this time on a wolf in shepherd's clothing. That's the main thrust of where we want to go. And how do they get in? What does that look like? How does it affect the church? At least from our perspectives. Me coming in late to the game, you were there, I think, second longest as far as when Pastor Tom was there. Lance, you were there the longest with Pastor Tom, correct?
And I believe you were also...
We were there the same amount of time with Pastor Tom.
Okay.
But I had gone to that church a lot longer than that time. But we were both going there when that church called Pastor Tom.
Okay.
And at that time, if I remember correctly, weren't you living with one of the elders of the
Yeah.
church. So
the head,
the head elder,
The chair elder,
the,
whatever.
chair,
you
the
probably-
chairman of the board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you're going to have, and just to preface this, you're going to have insights that I don't have and Steve doesn't have just because of your proximity to
Yeah.
that elder and the whole process. So
Yeah.
this is going to be very enlightening. We probably have different perspectives on things, and
Absolutely.
that's great. So
Yeah. So with the context of Church A, and the first point we kind of want to work through is getting desperate for a pastor. How do they get in these wolves in shepherd's clothing? We see examples of men getting into these churches, and every story is a little different. There's always nuance. There's always different perspectives and different ways these occur. But at Church A, what were some of the things that you guys saw? Because I came after he was already established, if you want to call it that. How did he get in? What did that look like? What was the church's mood? What were they doing in preparation for him? Why did they need a new head pastor? What was some of the context there?
So we had a pastor who was there for quite a long time. I think it was like 13 years. Okay. And he contracted Parkinson's disease and kind of became unable to fulfill the duties on a weekly basis of preaching and even the daily basis of counseling and things like that. And so the church began the process of looking for and calling a new pastor.
And approximately how long before PT came in?
It was a 3-year process. Okay. I was not there for all of that 3 years. But we were there probably 3-4 months before.
yeah, I was there a few months before they called Pastor Tom.
Yeah.
For sure. And
we started coming around the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really close. I don't remember if I was there a week or two before you or you were there a week or two before me, but it was pretty close.
yeah.
In the time, but that was me coming back. I had grown up in that church.
Yeah.
So they began the process of looking for a new pastor, and obviously they took their time, determined to find the right guy. And I think determined to find someone young enough that could take them through many years of pastoral shepherding.
So somebody with longevity, somebody who matched their branding, or however you want to phrase it, their denominational bent.
Their denominational bent, their theology, their ecclesiology, and all of that. The pastor that I actually started attending the church, when I started attending the church, it was the pastor before the 13-year guy.
Okay.
And he was only there 5 years. That was his... Found out later that was his MO. He went to a church for 5 years. He moved every 5 years to a different church. Felt like he had all he could say in 5 years.
Okay.
And then moved on. And so I think they really wanted someone who was going to give them, the longer tenure of pastor there. And so they began looking for the right guy. And then they took their time doing it.
So taking their time, and interrupt if you need to, Mike, but is there some advantages you see to a church taking that long? What would you, let me phrase it this way. What are the advantages to waiting 3 years or searching for 3 years? But what are also the disadvantages? And for both of y'all.
Yeah, I think not rushing into hiring someone is a good thing, right? When you, especially somebody you've never met before, right?
Yeah.
You don't know how long... you don't know that, I can pull the wool over somebody's eyes for 2 or 3 months even.
Yeah.
Just to.
We all can.
But their character begins to reveal itself over time. And I think in general, the hiring process in churches is too short. But there's no other way to do it. People want to start getting paid. There's really no other way to do it. It's very difficult. And so when it's your first ministry job and you don't have any references to call and check, it can be very difficult.
And was that some of what happened with Pastor Tom? There weren't a lot of references, or what was some of the, so we had a longer time frame. They ended up settling on Pastor Tom, obviously.
I would say they ended up settling for Pastor Tom.
Okay. So they settled for him. And do you think the long time frame played into that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
In my perception, it felt like the church was ready to be done searching.
Yeah.
I think
fair.
they were worn out of auditioning people, and they just wanted to get it done.
And you guys may not know
And
the
I get
answer.
that. I think fault them
Yeah.
for that at all.
And you may not know the answer to this, but were there quite a few men that they had gone through before they got to PT?
I mean, they had candidates all along the way. I do not know any of the reasons why those candidates were not viable.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But they did have candidates.
There were other men. So a little bit of it was being done with the process. The advantage to that then is you find a guy who meets what you need, rest in the Lord's providence in that, but then you also can get tired of the process in doing so. So what other factors led to Pastor Tom getting in? We see a church that had been on the hunt. They had some qualifications, a guy that could take them to length, met certain theological brandings or styles or convictions. How'd the ecclesiology of the church fit into that? The culture of the church, any of those factor into why they brought this man in?
One thing I remember Pastor Tom doing is resting heavily on his connection to John MacArthur. And I remember him talking about the fact that he was mentored by him, and he kind of had this get it while it's hot sort of presentation of like, if you guys don't take me, the next church will. So like, I'm one of John's like top proteges. So if you want to, do this, like I'm offering this, and like, you better jump on it. I remember that being part of his attitude. It wasn't upfront. It wasn't that arrogant, but it was definitely something I remember him bringing that I think created a false sense of urgency to try to bring him on. And I think that only appealed to certain guys on the board probably, and others probably perceived it as being, well, we'll see about that. Lance, your take?
Yeah, and I think, to defend a little bit, to defend Pastor Tom in that regard, I think that's kind of what you do when you're on the hiring tour, right? When you're candidating and you're doing these things, you kind of want to convince the church that you're candidating at that you're the right fit for them. And, there's a reason that we reached out to that brand of seminary graduate. We reached out both to Talbot and to Masters to bring guys before us that would be candidates for that.
And just to be clear, this is in no way an indictment of Masters or John MacArthur.
No, not
just
at
to be
all.
clear, this is
like
just
I said. There's
what
a reason
with this guy.
There's a reason we reached out to them.
Yeah,
we respected them, and they, had very good results with guests that had come from there and different things like that. And so we were excited about that prospect. In fact, we had at least one, I think two at the time, young men who were going to Master's Seminary at the time that Pastor Tom was called. We also had one going to Talbot at the time that Pastor Tom was called. So our church had relationships with both seminaries. But one of the key factors in getting Pastor Tom in the door was the church polity and the governing document.
The infamous governing
governing document that has been banned to hell
by Pastor Tom
by
himself.
Pastor Tom himself.
The Pastor Tom from the pulpit.
Yeah, on a day that we will talk about in a different.
Yes, which we alternatively some refer to as Black Sunday, some call Sunday Bloody Sunday.
Yes,
all valid monikers.
all definitely valid monikers. But this Constitution was written in response to a church split that had happened many years prior. We're probably talking 25 years prior to Pastor Tom coming, which would be, 40 years now? 40 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
That church constitution, the Church A was born out of a church split from another church. And the Constitution was written in response to that church split.
Side note, also known as a Baptist church plant. Just going to leave that there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's how Baptists plant churches.
Very true.
So the Constitution had a clause in it that there had to be 6 men on the board. Now, they did not use the word elder at the time. They had what were called deacons and trustees. But there had to be at least 6 deacons on the board in order to do business legally. So that meant, because that's what was on file with the state. So that meant in order to pay salaries, in order to hire, in order to fire, in order to pay bills, in order to make any financial decisions, there had to be 6 men on the board.
And 6 quote unquote qualified men.
Yeah, so then they would use, while they didn't call them elders, they used the qualifications of elders listed in the scriptures in Timothy and Titus, and they used those qualifications to determine who those men would be. And that's great. If you have a church of 300 to 500, you should be able to find 6 qualified men. But as your numbers begin dwindling, we have difficulty finding 6 qualified men in a church of 200.
Yeah, and that's around where Church A was at that point, was in the, 200 ballpark?
Like
Probably around
150, 200.
150, 200, somewhere between 150 and 225, I would say is a fair estimation. And it might sound shocking that I say it's hard to find 6 men in a church that size that are elder qualified, but the scriptures itself tells us that this is going to be a small group of men who are going to meet these requirements, right? And so it shouldn't be surprising if it was every man met these requirements, then Paul wouldn't have needed to give requirements.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Right? So
Exactly.
So the fact that he gives requirements lets us know that there's going to be some who don't meet them.
Right.
Right?
It's implicit for
It's
sure.
implicit. And so when you get a church of 150 or 200, that it becomes very difficult to find 6 qualified men. And so what happened in the case of Church A was that they needed 6 men to do business. So there wound up being, kind of look the other way kind of stuff. And so there wound up being, just frankly, unqualified men on the board at the time that Pastor Tom was called.
Men who aren't necessarily ungodly.
Not necessarily ungodly, not unbelievers, not,
don't meet the high standard that Paul places.
Correct.
And that's a lot of people.
It is.
It really is. It's not not a bad place, it's just not for that place of leader.
Yeah. And so you had these unqualified men that outnumbered the qualified ones. And so things slip through the cracks. When you've already opened the door to letting unqualified men in the room, then you open yourself up for hiring an unqualified man to lead those things.
People tend to find leaders like themselves.
Yeah.
It's just a natural bend.
Or possibly they lack the discernment to pick up on certain
Nonsense.
nuances that maybe someone who had a little more discernment might pick up on, because I would assume that some of the men probably picked up on some things with Pastor Tom that were alarming, or at least deserved further investigation and required some further follow-up that maybe some of the other guys weren't really in for. Lance, what was your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I know that the qualified men had concerns. The men on the board who were qualified did have some concerns about Pastor Tom, but they were outnumbered, and so he was able to get in there. Again, not necessarily to his... He didn't know that necessarily, right? There was like this perfect storm of unqualified men on the board and unqualified men coming to to
a church that's fatigued.
A church that's fatigued.
And even in the literal response, when you're tired, you don't have your best sense about you.
Yeah.
And that includes in the big relational places like that as well.
And 3 years without a shepherd.
That's hard.
Leaves you spiritually malnourished, I think is the best term for it.
Yeah.
Where you're just you're not as sharp on doctrine and different things like that as you would be have you had consistent sort of shepherding in that regard for the time. So spiritually malnourished, desperate in a certain way. That word sounds weird, but like they were just tired of the process.
Yeah, maybe fatigued.
Fatigued is a great
fair.
Fatigued is more fair.
Desperate in it.
And just kind of wanting to get that filled and move on with life.
Those all are big factors that can go into any major decision in anybody's life. When you have a communal environment like the church and a higher calling, it's where more caution takes over. You mentioned that some of the qualified deacons or elders, functioning elders, had concerns. Do you know what any of those concerns were beforehand? It's only been like 20 years.
There was some documentation that he was unable to provide.
That sounds familiar.
And it wasn't even, I know that we will talk or have talked about the ordination thing, but an actual diploma, he was unable to provide proof that he had graduated with his master's degree.
He made claims that he had.
He made claims that he had a master's degree. The job description listed that as a requirement. And he claimed that he met those requirements, but was unable to provide the documentation. And again, many of the men were happy to take him at his word rather than, and he had a series of excuses. We just moved. I can't find, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so many of the men were happy to take him at his word. That made some of the men uneasy. Just, man, I'd like to lay my eyes on that document, but I want to trust this guy. I don't know that anybody thought he was unqualified, but I think there were some men who had reservations.
And during that time where Pastor Tom had come around, the interview process had begun. So there's a fatigue, there's a lack of discernment. Some men who aren't ungodly, but necessarily unqualified, lacking some of the standards that maybe they should have had. Obviously, hindsight shows that. And these are general rules I would posit are in a lot of churches that make similar decisions. A perfect storm occurs. A lot of these factors probably cross over in other churches that bring wolves in as far as to shepherd the flock. With Church A, they pulled the trigger, obviously, and they brought him on board. So what were things about him that Church A liked that you would say were benefits that they saw as benefits? What were the things that they felt he had that they wanted?
Yeah.
I know his preaching had a lot of conviction behind it. I think that appealed to me, I know, as a young believer. I felt like he was willing to take a stand for something, which I also appreciated. And that was actually quite different than the previous pastor. I remember I had gone to that church for a while in high school, and the other pastor was a great guy, the man who contracted Parkinson's and was no longer pastoring. But in order to keep peace, I think he often allowed multiple views to stand, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I wouldn't fault him for that at all now. I think at that time of my walk, I felt like that was weak and, foolish. So for me, that appealed to me at the time, and now it would probably repulse me. But his ability to seemingly parse the scriptures well, and he also did some counseling, which got worse and worse with time. But his personal interactions at first seemed humble. They seemed like he was really a godly man, and he was presenting himself in such a way that he came across as kind of the perfect candidate for the church in a lot of ways. Not fully. I mean, there were a couple little things, but overall, he presented himself in such a way that he seemed like a really good candidate.
So we have a supposed conviction of the scriptures, a personality that I would say even to this day probably factors in, a likable guy. Absolutely. In a lot of ways.
Very charismatic.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those assessments. I think there was a lot of, I think at the beginning, the only reservations that some of the board members had was the inability to provide some documents.
And that was
other than that, stuff. he seemed to check all the boxes. I mean, very charismatic, very likable guy. Preached, like you said, preached with conviction. And to be fair, not that you were unfair to the previous pastor, he was a man full of grace and truth.
He really was. He was a great guy.
He was a great guy. He was really a good shepherd. And that's some of the things that, I was a young believer, you were a young believer. That hard line, like, this is the way it is kind of thing, that appealed to me. I think, some of my background, coming out of addiction to alcohol and things like that, I desired that rigidness. Like I needed somebody to tell me what to do, And
I know exactly what you mean.
So for me, he was the guy. He was like, that's who I want to be under. Even if I didn't have a legacy in that church, like I hadn't been there since I was 8 years old, I probably would have been very attracted to that style because of my past.
So we have somebody who's convictional on the exterior, somebody who seems to root himself in the scriptures, leads well, it seems. Not perfect, because no pastor is going to be, and everybody's going to have their foibles. Everybody will have their issues. So he comes in, hired on full time, but not ordained. And that's not uncommon, where you'll have a pastor come in and then ordination comes later. Step in, Lance.
I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that he said that he was ordained.
Okay.
But that the service and the certificate hadn't been done yet, but that he had gone through the steps of ordination through the college. I know that they do have that. That's part of
They do. They have an ordination prep class.
And he'd gone through all of that, and he was approved for ordination according to
because he passed
his testimony that
class.
He was approved for ordination, and then that just hadn't they just hadn't made it quote unquote official yet.
Okay.
And so that's how he checked that requirement box.
Okay.
Because that was also a requirement on the
So they did
hiring
require
process.
an ordained master's man with a master's degree to come in.
Yes.
So hindsight shows that there was no proof of graduation because hindsight has proven he wasn't.
Correct.
No proof of ordination.
Because hindsight has proven that he wasn't.
And still probably isn't. Although now in California, you can ordain your cat to marry you. So,
Yeah, you can buy one online. Last time I looked, it was $45.
Yeah. So
that's how I got mine.
Yeah. That's why my dog married me. And to my wife. That's just how it rolls here in Cali. So we have hindsight showing these issues, but obviously deceit was occurring.
From the get-go.
Yeah, from the get-go.
Without knowing.
Yes.
That's what deceit is, right? The people on the other side. I think that's some of the reservation. I think some of the men suspected that might be the case.
Without proof of that. And so they couldn't really act on it because they didn't have proof that he was lying to them. But the inability to come up with your documents that's a problem.
Was a problem.
So lack of discernment is an issue. And we all have those moments, not to knock anybody in particular.
Yeah.
We've all done
Especially
it.
when you're fatigued.
Yeah. It's true.
Right?
When you're tired, you don't have your best judgment.
And
It's just the way it
when
goes.
the person who you're, looking at is presenting themselves in a way that doesn't really set off alarms yet.
Yeah.
He played the role he needed to play up front to make it seem like he was really humble. So his attitude didn't come out at that point of his overbearing leadership model and his desire to dominate everyone.
Yeah.
He started off very much in what I would call false humility, I think.
He's a straight up deceiver.
Yeah.
I mean, hands down, he's just a deceiver. But like you said, Lance, you don't know you're being deceived until after you're deceived.
Hindsight is 20/20.
Yes, it is.
Tends to be. That's what I hear.
Yeah.
That's what the proverbial they say. So he comes in, and supposed ordination, but no paperwork. We'll phrase it that way. How long before, and I came shortly after his ordination service. That's what I'm just going to call it, though. That's really not what it was. How long before he was hired till that supposed ordination service, which was a mess. You know, hindsight shows it was a mess.
The service wasn't a mess.
No, but all the administration
All the
around it was.
background, everything in the
Yeah.
behind the scenes was a cluster.
Yes.
What we find out later had happened was he had set up John MacArthur to come down and install him. He told John, "Hey, I need you to do this installation."
I'd like you to.
Yeah, if you can. So he set that up. He told John, "You're installing me." He told the church, "He's ordaining me." That's what I remember.
So he told what the story that, or the way that I heard it was that he told John that the church was ordaining him. He told the church that he had already been ordained by masters and that John was just coming to do
The service.
to preach the service, and that's when everything would be made official. And so it was a deception of both sides of that. So John MacArthur and the master's side was being deceived into thinking that Church A was doing the ordination, and Church A was being deceived into thinking that Master's Seminary had already done the ordination. And so we brought together this service that was, I mean, it was amazing to have John MacArthur come in.
Yeah, it was a smaller church.
Yeah, it was a smaller church. It's not, and I would offer that that's one thing that Pastor Tom did not deceive us about was his relationship with John MacArthur.
There was a relationship.
There was a relationship there. John doesn't go around preaching every graduate's ordination service. So there was a relationship there that drew John to accept that invitation.
Yeah, so it helped Pastor Tom legitimize himself in the eyes of everyone to have John come and do
Absolutely.
that. Understandably, too. But my understanding also is that he printed out his own made-up ordination certificate at the church.
I don't know that it ever actually got printed out.
Okay, but he created one.
He created
in the church
one
office somewhere.
in
on
the
a
church
computer.
office somewhere on a computer. That's the story. I don't know that it ever got printed out because there were, an ordination certificate has a series of signatures on it because it's more than just one person that has to sign.
Yeah, it's a governing body of some kind that does it.
I didn't
It's
say
not
has
one
to sign
person.
those things.
Yeah.
That typically signs those things. It's more than mine has 4 signatures on it.
If we could put a whoosh sound in to where we're skipping location and time, this is where that sound effect would go in. Whoosh. There we go. So we're in the future from these events, but the past from today. I remember, and you may not have been at the split church. You may have already left.
Pastor Tom's church after
Pastor
the
Tom's
fact,
church,
yeah.
yeah.
B.
Church B.
Okay, we're going with Church B.
Church B. I remember him telling me that he was going to go golfing with John MacArthur, and he showed me an ordination certificate that he had. I don't know if he printed it out, if he bought it online, or what. And he made essentially the statement that, the day that I was ordained by John, it was busy. Everybody wanted to talk to John, and he rushed out without signing it. So I'm getting together with him, go golfing.
Can I just say, and I
then I would
interrupt
sign
that
it.
story?
Do it.
The ludicrousness of that statement
Oh, it's ridiculous.
is the same idea as a pastor not signing a wedding
Yes.
marriage license at the wedding,
And then you wait 5 years to get it signed.
because that's what you do as part of what you have on your mind as what I need to do that day.
Yeah. It's part
It's
of your-
on the
it's-
checklist.
It's on the checklist.
So he made the statement that John just forgot. It was busy. People were hitting him up for signatures and shaking babies and kissing hands. The normal stuff John does. And politicians. And he was going to go golfing with him and have him sign it. I never saw it signed. I don't know if he went golfing with him. And I've heard that John will, I don't know how much now since he's in his 80s, but at the time, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, still would do things like that, where he'd get together with students he had gotten to know, spend time with them, encourage them. That was part of his ministry as John MacArthur, regardless of what anybody may think of him, because there are varying opinions. But he was a man who loved his students and who loves the ministry. So we can whoosh back to the past.
There we go.
And the ordination day, quote unquote, ordination day, the production value here is just Disney-esque, if I may interject.
We spare no expense here.
Yeah,
at
we
Rants and Revelations.
We're basically Pixar in the Christian world in the audio form.
That's right.
So just so you guys...
Bootleg Pixar.
Yeah.
Pixar. We're Pixar. That's how we roll. So we're the Squire guitar of the podcast world. So we whoosh back over. Ordination day, quote unquote, comes. So he's told John they're doing it. He's told the church. John's just doing the message, but it's basically done. I wasn't there for that service. So what happened? John preaches evening service, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
He comes, he preaches. Anybody lay hands on PT?
I don't remember that. I don't remember that being done. The service was not weird at all. I mean, it was...
And John probably preached a good message.
He preached a great message. It was celebratory. We were all very happy to be there. The conversations afterwards were very encouraging and edifying. I mean, it seemed like a typical ordination service.
What you would expect. And having been ordained yourself, Lance, would you say it falls in line with some of the same flow of what you would expect?
Absolutely.
At ordination service? So
Yeah.
it fit.
Yeah, it fit.
It fit well.
It fit well. Except for, like, I don't have a vivid memory of anybody coming up and laying hands on. And the reason for that is because he told one side the other side was doing it, right? He told each side the other side was doing it.
Or one
and
side had already been done,
so
whatever.
If Masters had done it, they would have already laid the hands on with John, and he I don't know what he told John. Oh, that'll happen later. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I don't know why. I got the impression that he told John that John was coming to install him.
And that may have been the case as well.
And so it was supposed to be that.
That
That's
it was
my
just an
recollection.
installation service, and
Right.
that he told us it was his ordination.
Right.
service.
And that was my recollection. Whether that's accurate, or
That
not, I don't
probably
know.
sounds more because, I think John would question why there wasn't a laying on of hands at an ordination service. So I think that probably sounds more,
An installation service makes more sense. in
which
some
is
ways.
not uncommon either.
And technically was true. John was
That
installing
was
him
actually
there.
the truth.
Yeah, that was
that one was actually
yeah. He actually told John the truth,
but not
Yeah,
Church A.
not Church A.
Church A was under the belief that this was the finalization.
Which is probably who you need to be
ordination.
honest. I mean,
yeah,
honest
the
with.
church you're going to work at.
Yeah.
You probably don't want to lie to them about what's going on. But just the fact that John was there, I think, blinded people a bit.
Yeah,
I think you used the term earlier. It legitimized Pastor Tom.
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah,
the right phrasing.
Yeah.
Is that we just went like, okay, whatever reservations there might have been, John MacArthur agreeing to come do this, and us knowing full well that he doesn't agree to do this for every graduate, put some respect on Pastor Tom's name.
yeah, it absolutely did.
So
Yeah,
so. There's very clearly a root of deception and an arrogance in Pastor Tom.
I don't think we knew an arrogance then.
No, I agree. We didn't know about it, but there obviously was.
Hindsight again.
Hindsight shows there was.
Yeah.
So, and I agree, it's part of the deception. The
Yeah.
arrogance is hidden. The deception is hidden. That's how deception goes, as per
He had a
discussed.
huge false humility.
Yes. So
we didn't know that at the time, but I think early on we would have labeled him as a very humble man.
Agreed. And I came in shortly after the installation, ordination, whatever you want to call it, service. I think we came about a month or less after that, somewhere in there. And you see all these things we're discussing. I saw them. That's part of what attracted us. Was one, the brand, two, the character, the given character of the man and his family. Had a lovely family, lovely wife, lovely daughters. Seemed to love the church. Seemed to disciple, doing studies. Wanting to see the church grow. A younger guy, 30s? Was he in his 30s at the time?
I think so.
Church seemed to be growing. I mean, we were a younger family. I was in my late teens. I turned 19 there. I remember that. I had a younger brother and sister, so we started attending. You saw some fruit of the attraction that he brought, which was good. That's what you want. But there was very clearly false humility, arrogance, and some of the things that, to a degree, was attractional to our brand, the Master's brand, was also this dogmatism of dying on every hill. How did that factor into how the church led towards the split and towards him leaving? What did that do to the congregation?
I think that's a tactic that he used to try to prey on people through their convictions. Ultimately, I think at first it came across as a confident pastor, someone who is willing to take a stand on doctrine and not waver, which seemed like a good thing. But at some point, a switch flipped. And I don't know exactly when it was, Lance. Maybe you can speak to this better. But at some point, a switch flipped, and he went from this seemingly humble guy to a guy who was trying to grab as much power as he could as quickly as he could. And he used the pulpit as a weapon, and he used Scripture as a weapon. And as he weaponized Scripture, he weaponized people's convictions as well. And what I understand now, and there's multiple angles to take this from, the biblical angle, which is primary, is a false teacher will deceive people with Scripture. And they'll use their power wrongly. They'll misuse their authority. They will try to get people to become subject to them instead of Jesus. They want to be the ultimate authority in people's lives. On the psychology side of it, there's also a really interesting profile of what's called a grandiose narcissist. And if you read up on that, this guy fit that to a T.
Which, by the way, grandiose narcissist, best cheesecake you'll ever have. Just throwing that out there.
This is a cheesecake?
It should be. I'm just saying, if it isn't, we got to make it.
The grandiose narcissist cheesecake.
Yeah, they sell it at Cheesecake Factory. But I digress. So enough of my nonsense.
That's a good one.
Back to you.
But if you look at how narcissists go about recruiting, subjugating people, it's the same as a false teacher. In a lot of ways, is the same as a grandiose narcissist. They're just two different sort of approaches to the same sort of personality type. And one of the things that these guys do is they use Scripture in such a way as to create false obedience to them. They want to make people subject to them as their personal little followers. So
like a fiefdom.
Yeah, like they want them to be their little slaves, really.
Which, to boil it down, is a cult tactic.
100%.
100% cult tactic. You look at Mormonism, you look at Jehovah's Witnesses, and major cult to minor cult, and everything in between. You see that as a major factor.
Yeah. Yeah, and he started that process. I don't know how cognizant he was of what he was doing specifically, or if he just sort of couldn't help himself but be that way. I mean, he was pretty slick, so he could have known exactly what he was doing. But he started dying on every hill doctrinally, and he emphasized every single thing as if it was equally important to your salvation, to the gospel. And doctrine started to blur. You started to get this working back in of secondary doctrines into the gospel, and making specifically, he went into the 5 points of Calvinism. And he started preaching on sovereignty, on depravity, on election. And he started pushing those issues to the point that he literally pushed them into the gospel. And where, hey, if you're not believing in this, it's questionable. It made it feel like, if you didn't believe it, like you might not really be saved. And that really ruffled some feathers. Lance, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a fair assessment. I think that he reverse engineered a lot of things, like you were talking about. We're bringing back into the pure gospel, and setting his interpretation of the Scripture up as chief, so that any disagreement with that would be labeled false teaching, when he was the actual false teacher. And
very clever.
It's very clever, and I think it's common in that sort of thing. My opinion, 20 years later, I think he knew what he was doing from the beginning. Yeah. I don't know the guy's, I can't read his mind, but I don't think there was a switch flipped. I think that was always the plan.
I would definitely agree with that. I think he just had to figure out when the right time was to pounce.
Time was to pounce. Yeah. But I think the plan was always that. I think that he preyed on a malnourished church in order to enhance his platform.
Yeah.
and his power. I just think that it became, and again, I know for you and I in particular, that was very appealing. Kind of being told what to do was something that we needed in our lives at the time. And so I had this really weird situation where I looked up to Pastor Tom and I really appreciated his preaching and the way that he was giving us the word. And I remember one Sunday saying to you, like, man, when he gets done preaching, I just want to go rub my head on the sidewalk until it's bloody.
You know,
I remember that.
You know?
Yeah.
And like
the
being
conviction
proud
was so great.
and being proud of that fact. Like
that
that's-
was a good
Like
thing,
that was
yeah.
a good thing that I wanted to go do that, you know, because I felt so unworthy of all of this stuff that I needed to go, you know,
Do
in my own
penance.
mind pay penance. He would never have he did not offer that, right? Like he didn't say go pay penance, but like to me that felt like what I needed to do. And then I'd go home as I'm living with the chairman of the board, and he and his wife would be I would overhear conversations with he and his wife talking about, man, what a disastrous sermon, what a potentially dangerous sermon that was today, and you know all this kind of stuff. And I'm like,
You guys are
and I
smoking
highly respect both men.
So you're trying to
And I'm like, I'm
struggle
sitting
through
in the
it.
middle, just going like, I have no idea what to play. You know what I mean? It's like I have no idea what to think.
Yeah, and I was in a similar situation at home when I was living with my grandparents, and they weren't too impressed with Pastor Tom. But the problem was I thought I was so much smarter than everybody, and especially my grandparents, which is so sad in hindsight, and I regret this, but that's where I was at the time. And I felt like, well, their doctrine is so weak, you know, they don't really even understand the scriptures, so it was easier for me to dismiss them, which is sad. Really sad in hindsight. I wish I would have been more conflicted, but I was still in a very uncomfortable position because I was defending him and they were saying, yeah, not really digging it.
And Tom set it up that way so that we started to believe that anybody who didn't agree with what he was saying was weak doctrinally.
Yes,
You know what I mean?
Or divisive.
Or divisive,
I remember the message from Corinthians that love trusts all things, and his
believes the best is what he's.
that's how he
believes the
applied it.
best
Love
about
believes the
people.
best, and he used that as a way to get you to not question authority or leadership, or trust, you know, that he knew what he was doing, to twist the scriptures for his own gain.
I was going to say what's interesting about that particular thing is that actually, in my case, that actually backfired on him because I loved the people I was living with, and so I believed the best about them as well as about him. And so here I am trying to believe the best about both parties, and
how do
that's
you
where
balance
that's
that?
where the confliction came.
Yeah.
Jude tells us these people are discontent grumblers, living according to their desires. Their mouths utter arrogant words, flattering people for their own advantage. And that really describes PT quite well, to a T. It really does. Everything we're talking about rests in Jude's description of the apostate or the wolf in shepherd's clothing, and factors into the slickness of words. You then remember Paul's call to the Ephesians to not be children in your thinking, so you will not be deceived. And that's where we were. We were young Christians, newer believers growing in the faith, and arrogant. I think all three of us would say that.
I think that's totally fair.
At least Mike. We'll go with that.
Oh, yeah.
All of us were.
What's
And-
interesting about that is I was talking to Mike earlier on the phone, and I feel like he and I, early on, we were both pretty dogmatic. We were dogmatists. We were like, and we were harsh about it, where you've always been you come across as very chill.
That's more personality.
Yeah.
Where I'm more passive just by nature.
Yeah.
Like I'm like Rex from Toy Story, where I don't like confrontations, you know, and that's something I've had to work through. But because of that, I kind of take a back seat and observe more. But that's personality. You guys are a little more just willing to stand up and voice opinions more so than I am. I'm like, hey, let's just hang out. And that has both have advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah. Well, I remember someone, I think it was the college pastor at the time, referring to us as the Sons of Thunder for a while.
Now known
Which
as
Which we wore as a badge of honor. Yes.
Yeah.
And now I look back on it and go,
Now you label it the
Jesus
Sons of
was
Chunder.
not giving that as a good title for,
There wasn't
for
a
James and John.
That was not a quality moniker.
no, he was not.
Yeah.
So we have this deception. We have a man who's overtly deceiving, fulfilling the prophecy of Jude, essentially, in the context here in Southern California for us. And it leads up to a church split. So we're going to get to that on another day. But what are some of the factors that you both saw? And since I came in late to the game, we didn't know much about PT. We knew he was a master's guy. We knew he stood doctrinally. He taught like John MacArthur in some ways, which we wanted because we saw value in it. But we didn't know much more than that. And we saw people we loved, and we saw people who didn't like him, and his wife's lovely, his children are great. He's humble, quote unquote. So we just went with that. And after the split, my family left along with me for those reasons. But what are some things you saw building up to the split, to Black Sunday, as we've called it? Not getting to Black Sunday, but what's some of the pressure that built towards that?
He started preaching about slander at one point, and he had switched away from, I remember it this way. I remember he was preaching about sovereignty, and then he suddenly switched and did this mini-series on slander. And the main thrust of it was, if you speak out against him, you're sinning against God. That was the take-home.
Don't touch the Lord's anointed kind of a thing.
Yeah, he had this vision of the pastorate that put the pastor in this supreme leader category apart from all of the rest of the congregation. And he used certain passages to try to push that. One of them was a verse, and I don't have the address on the tip of my tongue, but it's it speaks about it in Jude, and I think the other one's in 2 Peter possibly, but it says that these people have no problem reviling angelic majesties. And he said angelic majesties referred to pastors and elders. So if
That's
you're
exciting.
reviling an angelic majesty, you are slandering a pastor, you are sinning against God. And basically he was just trying to shut everyone up who was worried about his demeanor and approach to everything. Also, I remember there was a specific lady in the congregation who started having some meetings at her house about getting rid of Pastor Tom. And one of the tactics he used was to discredit her and make her out to be like a crazy cat lady who no one should even listen to or talk to. And if you paid attention to her, again, you're sinning against God because you're slandering the pastor, and the pastor is the supreme leader, and you are in violation of God's law, and you're going to get zapped, basically. You're going to get lightning strike or something.
Yeah, and I think that, to kind of solidify what you're saying, I had heard those criticisms from the folks that I was living with, and others, not just the ones that I was living with, the others who were concerned about the direction that Tom was going. But I didn't quite buy that necessarily. I'm like, who would actually think that of themselves? But two instances for me, he actually told me. I was sitting in his office, and he told me that it was impossible. When he was behind the pulpit, it was impossible for him to err.
He's the Pope.
It was impossible because he was then the mouthpiece of God.
He's pontificating.
He's pontificating.
He's ex
from behind
cathedra.
And when he said that, I went, whoa, right, in my head. And then the thing that nailed the coffin was actually after the split was complete. A representative of the denomination that we belonged to helped mediate kind of that split, come up with a workable agreement on what financial package and things like that would do that. And then after he did that, he said, "I have never met anyone with such a Messiah complex in my life."
Wow. And this is a guy who does this for a living.
This is a guy who does this for a living. And
It's impressive.
Yes.
That's
I
impressive
was
in
like,
a bad way.
oh, so all that was was true.
It was
You know?
true. So we have a guy who's deceiving, who's preaching to protect himself in the pulpit. People are picking up on it now. And that's really what builds the pressure then, is people are starting to figure out, okay, there's things that are jacked up here. I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they actually had to cancel his church card because he was racking up cash.
So early on, he had submitted to redo his office. He wanted to, and to be fair,
It needed it.
it could have used a fresh coat of paint, but it wasn't bad, right? But it could have used a fresh coat of paint. And he wanted to do that. And so they had approved like paint and something else. Well, then he went out and bought paint and carpet and, all this brand
Bookshelves,
new bookshelves
yeah.
and hired a contractor to come in, and there was a built-in bookcase, and he wanted to close that off. Just like all this stuff, and all of a sudden they're like, getting
What's
their
up?
credit card bills, and so they shut off his card, and then in order to complete the project, Pastor Tom went to the little old ladies Sunday school class and petitioned for money, and they gave him cash to finish
Yikes.
the project. It was probably more than just the little old ladies Sunday school class, but he started with the elderly.
Wow.
Worked
and
his way through.
Worked his way through.
It's a classy move.
So
Just keep it
He
classy.
keeps it classy.
Keeps it classy. So we've seen characteristics of a false teacher, the wolf in shepherd's clothing. They seek, in the deception, there's truth there. And hindsight shows that he was preaching truth. We've all discovered, I think, in our own time and own way, that it was a lot of plagiarism. And by a lot, I mean basically all the stuff that fed our souls was plagiarism, because the truth was being preached from a plagiarized message, and the Spirit used that. When he went into his own wacky stuff of exegeting, quote unquote, the text and applying it, it was nonsense in many ways. It creates confusion, creates delay, and creates that culmination. The mature realize it quicker.
yeah.
The immature tend to be more deceived, and that's where we were.
Yeah, I was
And a
going
lot
to
of
say
that-
that from our perspective, it was hard to see the difference
Yes.
because he had established himself as this solid Bible teacher, and then
Installed
he began
by John.
installed by John and preaching these messages that I don't think anybody in the church necessarily at the beginning would have a problem with. And then all of a sudden, when things take a turn, the more discerning and mature members of the congregation begin to see it, and us and others are like, we're relying on the equity that he's built
Yeah.
in the past, going, well, no, that's not who he is. So you must be wrong because this is what he is.
The fruit of that is you either have a giant cult or you have a church split. I mean, that's really the only two avenues that can go. Or, by ejecting him, you have a church split regardless, because people will leave no matter what. People will be deceived. Unfortunately, if you don't, it's not a bad thing. It's just human nature doesn't really dictate that. Sin tends to prevent that, where deception occurs, and people leave regardless, even if you remove the cancer of the false shepherd. So anything to add before we end this episode? The ideas of the false shepherd, getting in, maybe some encouragement, some warnings, some synopsis of things maybe we hadn't been able to touch on before we call it a close.
I think that I want to be clear. I think we all want to be clear on this, but we want to be clear that we have a deep love for Church A,
Yeah.
and that
Absolutely.
we understand the environment in which they were in at the time,
Yeah.
and how this happened. A lot of respect and love for their current leadership over there. A lot of respect and love for the leadership that was there at the time, even. And just understanding. So if you find yourself in this situation, it's not always the church. It's not always the church's fault, right? There's many factors that play into how we got to this point. Just wanting to affirm our love and respect for Church A, even though none of us attend there now. but just love and respect for that church, and I don't blame them for any of what happened with Pastor Tom and the effects that he had on our lives.
Same
I
here.
did earlier at first, but now that I've come out of all of it, I don't blame them one bit.
Yeah, same for me.
Yeah.
There was much need to place the blame upon them because we were told to. That was a part of it.
Yeah, later on, he literally said he wished the ground would open up in the middle of the sanctuary and swallow the whole church, like fire come, like the sons of Korah.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah, he was so angry. Years later, I was puzzled by it, but not anymore.
That's how it goes. And I'd say also for the ministry of MacArthur, none of us would say it's a perfect ministry. But
There isn't such thing.
Exactly. But I would say we all hold the teachings of John to a high standard to where we are willing to interact with it and work with it, knowing that it's not the only truth out there, but there is a good source.
Absolutely.
And that a large place such as the Master Seminary, Grace Community Church, cannot keep everything pure and clean from seeping out. There's been many men from that seminary who have done the same thing, if not worse, but every other seminary too.
Yeah, that's the
Every
thing, is
other
it's
seminary.
not limited to just them.
It's not.
And there's a huge amount of respect for Dr. MacArthur as a Bible teacher and as an expositor of Scripture. I have a huge amount of respect for his ministry, and that seminary has turned out many good pastors as well.
And some of our friends.
So some of our good friends
that
are.
we know. I have very good friends who, and I attend a master's
Me
church,
too.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, John was not complicit
No.
in this.
He was deceived as well.
duped.
He was duped as well.
Yeah. So let's not get that twisted that he was somehow complicit in this. He didn't know that this guy was the way he was, because this guy was slick, man.
Yeah.
Pastor Tom was slick. He was really good at playing the role when he needed to.
Yeah.
So I would also add, if you're seeing things like this and you're feeling like maybe you're in a context that's unhealthy, just keep your eyes open, keep praying, and trust the Holy Spirit to lead you. Don't let somebody dominate you and put themselves in a position where they are your supreme ruler as a pastor, because Jesus says in the Gospels, he says, call no man on earth your father, because you have one Father who's in heaven, and call no man on earth your rabbi or teacher, because you have one teacher and you're all brothers. And this is, he's saying to the disciples and the entire crowd, not just the disciples, the direct disciples, but the whole crowd. So no one has the right to be your spiritual father or set themselves up as your teacher on earth in that way. That is anti-Christian, just to be clear.
Well, this has been Rants and Revelations with Mike, Lance, and Steve, the trifecta, unholy trinity. Well, maybe not that.
Emphasis on unholy.
Yeah, let's get that
You
straight.
know who we are. We hope this has been edifying. We hope this has been educational in some ways. As we say in our preface, this isn't the end all of everything. Our perspective, our journey in many ways, and which we hope to share more of. So tune in next time for Rants and Revelations.